As the frail old man lay gasping for breath surrounded by his estranged family, his trembling lips muttered a confession that sent chills through the room. "I faked my death in 1994 to escape a secret that could have gotten us all killed." His sunken eyes darted frantically as if reliving the terror he fled from decades ago. The air grew heavy with dread. What could be so dangerous that it drove a man to erase himself from existence? And now, why was he revealing it with his final breath? The summer of 1994 seemed perfect in Cedar Falls, Pennsylvania. Alexander "Lex" Hargrove, a brilliant cryptographer at Apex Tech Solutions, had it all: a sharp mind, a promising career, a loving wife named Caroline, and a newborn daughter, Ivy. But one ordinary day turned into a nightmare when Lex stumbled upon a secret so dangerous it shattered his life forever. It started with a seemingly routine assignment: analyzing encrypted files for a government project. Lex had spent years breaking codes, but the files he encountered that day were different. Hidden beneath multiple layers of encryption, their secrecy screamed of something forbidden. With patience and precision, Lex cracked the code and accessed a folder labeled Obsidian, Veil, Red List. What he found froze him in place. The files contained evidence of operations that spanned decades: high-profile assassinations masked as accidents, illegal surveillance on world leaders, and grotesque experiments carried out on unwitting subjects. The implications were horrifying. But what truly stole Lex's breath was the final file: a list of targets deemed threats to the organization. His own name was there, accompanied by a grainy photograph and two haunting words: "Terminate immediately." Lex's heart pounded. He knew he had stumbled upon something far beyond classified information. A text flashed on his screen: "You've seen too much." Panic surged through him as he scrambled to erase his access logs, but he knew it was futile. Whoever controlled this data had already marked him. That evening, Lex drove home, his mind racing. Pulling into his driveway, his eyes locked on an unmarked black SUV idling across the street. Its windows were tinted, and though no one stepped out, Lex felt their presence. Caroline greeted him at the door, her smile briefly softening the dread in his chest. She had no idea of the storm brewing around them. Lex couldn't sleep that night. He stayed awake, piecing together a desperate plan. Obsidian Veil wasn't an enemy he could confront or escape from. Not permanently. Their reach was vast, their resources infinite. If he wanted to protect Caroline and Ivy, he needed to do something unthinkable: erase himself from their lives completely. By dawn, his plan was in motion. The next day, Lex meticulously prepared. He withdrew cash from multiple accounts, forged new documents, and erased every trace of his existence he could find. That evening, he drove to a remote stretch of Highway 67, a dangerous road infamous for fatal accidents. This would be where Alexander Hargrove ceased to exist. Lex parked his silver sedan near the edge of a ravine. He siphoned gasoline into the interior of the car, careful not to leave any traces of DNA. Beneath the driver's seat, he placed a small incendiary device. Every step of the plan was calculated. Before stepping away, he stared at his reflection in the car window, knowing it would be the last time he saw himself as Alexander Hargrove. With a deep breath, Lex ignited the device and retreated into the woods. The explosion shattered the stillness of the night, flames consuming the car within moments. Hidden among the trees, Lex watched as the fire consumed his old life. A passing motorist called for help, and soon the scene was flooded with emergency responders. The plan had worked, or so he hoped. News of Lex's death spread quickly. Investigators found charred remains in the car, too damaged for identification but enough to confirm their conclusion. Alexander Hargrove had died in a tragic accident. Caroline, devastated, buried an empty casket. She clutched Ivy tightly during the funeral, her sobs echoing in the cemetery. Lex, hidden in the shadows, watched from afar. Tears streamed down his face as he saw his wife collapse to her knees. It was the last time he would ever see them. The man once known as Alexander Hargrove was gone. In his place was Elliot Grayson, a ghost without a past or future. Lex dyed his hair, grew a beard, and even burned his fingerprints with acid, a searing pain he endured in silence. He drifted from town to town, taking odd jobs, always looking over his shoulder. Every unfamiliar face, every knock on the door, felt like a potential threat. Despite his efforts to vanish, Lex couldn't shake the guilt. Caroline and Ivy were safe, but they were alone. To ease his conscience, he arranged anonymous payments to Caroline through offshore accounts, ensuring she and Ivy never wanted for anything. But he knew he could never contact them. Doing so would put them at risk, a risk he couldn't take. Years passed, but Lex's paranoia only grew. Obsidian Vale's reach was vast, and he knew they wouldn't stop searching for him. Even in isolation, he felt their shadow looming over every aspect of his life. But worse than his fear for his own safety was the constant dread that they might one day target Caroline and Ivy. His sacrifice might have been in vain. Lex clung to a fragile hope that his family would one day understand his actions, hope that the truth about Obsidian Vale would come to light, and perhaps, most of all, hope that he might finally live without fear. But as he drifted through his shadowy existence, Lex knew the truth. As long as Obsidian Vale existed, neither he nor his family would ever truly be safe. For Alexander Lex Hargrove, now living under the alias Elliot Grayson, life had become an endless sequence of borrowed faces and unfamiliar places. The small Pennsylvania town he once called home felt like a distant dream, replaced by a shadowy existence that demanded constant vigilance. Lex had sacrificed everything to protect his family, but the cost of his freedom was the secret he carried, a truth so dangerous it had driven him to fake his death. Lex had been a rising star at Apex Tech Solutions, a cryptographer celebrated for solving the unsolvable. But the files he accessed in his final days there revealed a world of shadows far darker than he could have imagined. These files belonged to Obsidian Vale, a covert cabal that operated above governments and outside the law. They weren't merely a corporation or rogue agency. They were puppet masters, manipulating the world from the shadows. And Lex had stumbled into their web. The files were a roadmap of atrocities. Obsidian Vale had operatives embedded in global governments, secret accounts funneling billions into illegal operations, and diagrams of experimental projects that defied the limits of science and morality. But the most haunting document was the Red List, a roster of individuals deemed threats to their agenda. It was filled with names of journalists, whistleblowers, and dissenters who had vanished over the years. And among them was his own name, accompanied by the chilling directive: terminate immediately. Even now, years later, Lex couldn't escape the weight of that discovery. The knowledge was both his curse and his only weapon, a burden he carried as he moved from one identity to the next. But disappearing wasn't as simple as changing his name. Obsidian Vale's reach was vast, and their operatives were relentless. Even as he erased every trace of his existence, Lex couldn't escape their shadow. In Montana, while living in a remote cabin, Lex found a note slipped under his door. It read, "We found you." The words sent a chill down his spine. He fled that night, leaving behind everything he had built for that fleeting moment of peace. The incident wasn't isolated. In Kansas City, a blackout in his apartment coincided with footsteps outside his door. In Mexico, a man claiming to be a salesman asked him pointed questions about his past. Lex couldn't be sure if these were coincidences or veiled threats, but he treated every encounter as a warning. Through it all, Lex clung to a journal he had kept since the day he faked his death. A weathered leather book, it was filled with hastily scrawled notes, diagrams, and codes he had copied from Obsidian Vale's files. Among the notes was a cryptic clue he had never deciphered: a set of coordinates paired with the phrase, "the glass box." It became his obsession, the one thread he hoped would unravel the truth. Lex's paranoia deepened as the years passed. His once logical mind now felt like a maze of fear and regret. He often replayed the day he left Caroline and Ivy, questioning if his sacrifice had truly saved them or condemned them to grief. The thought that Obsidian Vale might still be watching his family haunted him. His life of exile was supposed to shield them, but what if it had only delayed the inevitable? These thoughts gnawed at him, especially on long, solitary nights when silence was his only companion. One frigid night in Alaska, living under the name Michael Crane, Lex received a chilling reminder of his past. As he sat in a dimly lit diner, a man in a nondescript suit entered and scanned the room. His gaze was sharp and deliberate. When their eyes met, Lex's heart sank. The man didn't approach, but his presence was enough to confirm what Lex had feared. Obsidian Vale hadn't forgotten him. That night, Lex fled Alaska, abandoning yet another identity. He erased every trace of himself, packed what little he could carry, and boarded a train heading south, deeper into anonymity. Every station he passed felt like another layer of safety, though he knew it was an illusion. Obsidian Vale had eyes everywhere, and their patience was infinite. Through it all, the journal remained his lifeline, a testament to the darkness he had uncovered and a promise that he wouldn't let it consume him. Yet, as the years stretched on, Lex began to doubt whether his efforts would ever make a difference. Could one man, alone and hunted, truly hope to take down a force as powerful as Obsidian Vale? His mind often wandered back to the cryptic message in his journal. The glass box. What did it mean? Was it a place, a code, or perhaps a trap laid by the very people he was running from? The secret he carried was his burden, his curse, and his only weapon. And though he had spent years running, he knew the time would come when he would have to stop. Obsidian Vale had taken everything from him, but they hadn't destroyed him. Not yet. Lex vowed that one day he would strike back. Until then, he would keep running, hiding, and keeping the secret alive. Because as long as he lived, there was still a chance, however small, that he could make things right. That slim hope was all that kept him moving forward. For Lex Hargrove, now permanently hidden behind the mask of Elliot Grayson, time had become an indistinct blur. The years passed, marked only by the shifting faces of strangers and the fleeting places he called home. A life of shadows demanded sacrifices he had not foreseen, a severance of connection, a burial of his past self, and a loneliness so profound it almost outweighed the fear keeping him alive. After Alaska, Lex doubled his precautions. He avoided cities, choosing isolated locations far from prying eyes. His pattern of living became one of complete unpredictability. He'd rent a room above a bar in one town, stay a few weeks, then vanish without notice, sometimes in the dead of night. He traveled by back roads, hitchhiking when necessary, paying only in cash. Phones and computers became forbidden. Lex had long since learned that digital traces were fatal. Despite his precautions, Lex couldn't ignore the signs that Obsidian Vale was still hunting him. In a Wyoming motel, two men in suits checked into the room next to his. That night, Lex escaped through the bathroom window, leaving behind only what he couldn't carry. In a sleepy Oregon fishing village, he awoke to find tire tracks near the woods where he had hidden his car. Whether these were coincidences or proof of pursuit, he never knew, but he couldn't take chances. Through it all, Lex clung to the journal. Its pages, filled with frantic scribbles and diagrams, were his only tether to the truth. The cryptic message, the glass box, was an obsession he couldn't abandon. Was it a place, a person, or an idea? All he knew was it had been important enough to encode within Obsidian Vale's most secret files. The journal felt like both a lifeline and a time bomb, evidence that could one day bring the organization down. Years turned into decades, and Lex noticed how the world changed. Technology advanced at a pace that made invisibility nearly impossible. Smartphones became ubiquitous, cameras covered every street, and biometric scans were routine. Tools that made life easier for others became deadly obstacles for him. Remaining unseen grew more exhausting with each passing year. The loneliness gnawed at him. Once, in a small Colorado town, he struck up a cautious friendship with a widowed librarian named Ruth. She was kind but quiet, never asking about his past. For a brief moment, Lex imagined a life where he wasn't constantly running, but even that fragile bond was doomed. One evening, as he helped Ruth lock the library, he spotted an unmarked car parked across the street. The next morning, he was gone, leaving behind another faint echo of what could never be. The journal grew thicker as Lex documented every potential lead on Obsidian Vale. In Arizona, he found an obscure academic text referencing the glass box as a metaphorical repository of truths too dangerous to reveal. But the phrase haunted him. Could it be literal, a location, or vault? Or was it a coded instruction meant for someone else entirely? His health began to decline. Years of stress, poor nutrition, and exposure to the elements ravaged his body. Lex's hands, once steady enough to crack the most complex codes, trembled as he wrote. His face, unrecognizable even to himself, bore the marks of a life spent running. Yet the fire in his eyes remained, a relentless drive to destroy the organization that had stolen his life. One fateful night in Nevada, Lex stumbled upon a clue that reignited his mission. Sifting through discarded newspapers behind a diner, he found an article mentioning a defunct government facility in New Mexico, called The Box by locals. The site, abandoned for decades, had been used for top-secret experiments. The connection to the glass box was impossible to ignore. For the first time in years, Lex felt a glimmer of purpose. The journey to New Mexico was grueling. Lex avoided highways, traveling under the cover of night and relying on the kindness of strangers for food and shelter. When he reached the outskirts of the facility, his breath caught. The building, surrounded by rusted fences and overgrown weeds, radiated abandonment, but Lex knew better than to trust appearances. He spent 3 days observing the site, scanning for sensors, cameras, or signs of activity. On the 4th night, Lex made his move. Armed only with his journal, a flashlight, and his wits, he slipped through a gap in the fence and approached the facility. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the floor amplifying his vulnerability. The interior was a labyrinth of empty hallways strewn with debris and faded radiation warnings. But deep within the building, Lex found something that made his pulse race: a reinforced steel door, partially hidden behind collapsed shelving. Whatever lay behind that door was either the key to bringing Obsidian Vale down or a trap that would end his life. For the first time in decades, Lex hesitated. Clutching the journal tightly, he knew that every step forward brought him closer to the truth, or his own destruction. The steel door loomed before Lex, its surface marred by time but exuding an aura of indestructibility. Every fiber of his being told him to turn back, to abandon the quest that had consumed his life. But as he clutched the journal tighter, the weight of everything he had lost pressed him forward. Whatever lay behind that door was either salvation or oblivion. The door had no handle, only a keypad with faded numbers and a faint glow. Decades of running hadn't dulled Lex's intellect. He quickly recognized it as an old biometric lock with a secondary override code. He flipped through the journal, searching for anything relevant. Near the back, he found it, a sequence of numbers scrawled beneath the phrase, "the glass box." Taking a deep breath, Lex keyed in the numbers, 4728893. The keypad blinked and emitted a faint beep. For a moment, nothing happened, and Lex feared he'd triggered an alarm. Then, with a groan of old machinery, the door slid open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. The air grew colder as Lex descended, the scent of mildew clinging to the walls. His flashlight illuminated each dusty step. At the bottom, he found himself in a cavernous room filled with filing cabinets, outdated computer terminals, and stacks of surveillance tapes. This wasn't just a storage area, it was a graveyard of secrets. Lex approached a cabinet and pulled open a drawer with trembling hands. Inside were dossiers labeled with names and dates, many marked with words like eliminated or active threat. Flipping through, his stomach churned. These were lives destroyed in service of Obsidian Vale's agenda. Then he froze. Among the files he found a name he knew, Caroline Hargrove. His breath hitched as he opened the file. Inside were photographs of Caroline, taken years after he disappeared. There were notes detailing her movements, her job, and even Ivy's school. Obsidian Vale had been watching them all along. Despite his efforts to protect them, they had never been safe. Anger boiled within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He flipped through more files, searching for anything that could expose the organization. At the back of a drawer, he found a sealed envelope labeled Project Glass Box, Eyes Only. Tearing it open, Lex found documents outlining an operation that chilled him to the core. Project Glassbox wasn't just a repository of truths, it was a contingency plan. If exposed, Obsidian Vale would activate sleeper agents embedded in governments and corporations to orchestrate chaos on a global scale. The final page bore the chilling words, "In chaos, we thrive." Lex understood the stakes now. Exposing Obsidian Vale wouldn't just destroy them, it could destabilize the world. The organization had built failsafes to ensure any attack against them would come at a catastrophic cost. His mission had transformed. It was no longer just about survival. It was about balancing truth with the risk of devastation. As he gathered the documents, footsteps echoed from the staircase above. Panic gripped him. He extinguished his flashlight and pressed against the wall. The steps grew louder, accompanied by the hum of a radio. Someone else was here, and they were descending fast. Scanning the room, Lex spotted a ventilation shaft behind a stack of crates. Quickly, he removed the cover and slid inside. The narrow space was suffocating, but he crawled forward silently. Below, a man in tactical gear entered the room, his flashlight sweeping across the cabinets. He moved with precision. This wasn't a guard, it was a professional. The man paused at the open drawer Lex had searched, his flashlight lingering. He reached for his radio and spoke in a clipped tone. "The site's been compromised. Initiating containment protocol." Lex's heart sank. He knew what that meant. The facility wasn't just a vault, it was a trap rigged for destruction. Whoever this man was, he was here to ensure that no one left with its secrets. Lex moved faster, muscles straining as he crawled through the shaft. Somewhere behind him, machinery roared to life. The walls vibrated and the air grew warmer. Explosives. The facility was preparing to implode. Bursting from the vent into a side corridor, Lex sprinted toward the exit. The first explosion rocked the ground, sending debris raining from above. Dust choked the air and his lungs burned as he pushed forward. Every step felt like a lifetime. But finally, he emerged into the night. Behind him, the facility collapsed in on itself, a plume of smoke and fire erupting into the sky. Lex collapsed onto the dirt, clutching the files against his chest. He had survived, but the cost was overwhelming. The secrets he carried could save the world, or destroy it, and now, more than ever, he understood the weight of the war he was fighting. The night stretched endlessly as he lay on the ground, staring at the horizon. The collapse of the facility was only the beginning. He had the documents, the evidence of Obsidian Vale's reach, but now came the real challenge, finding someone he could trust to share them with. Who could he turn to without risking another trap? The answer was unclear, but the path ahead was unavoidable. Lex knew the war was far from over, and his role in it had just begun. Lex Hargrove lay on the cold dirt, staring at the stars scattered across the endless sky. The facility was gone, obliterated by explosions meant to erase not only its secrets, but him as well. Yet, despite his escape, there was no sense of relief. The files he had salvaged felt heavier than ever, burdened with the realization of their danger. They could expose Obsidian Vale, but they could also ignite chaos on an unimaginable scale. The question burned in his mind. Who can I trust? Decades of running had taught Lex to see danger in every face, every whisper, every fleeting shadow. Trust was a luxury he could no longer afford, and yet the documents demanded action. They had to reach someone capable of exposing Obsidian Vale without triggering the organization's catastrophic failsafe. But who could handle such a task? The nearest town, Crescent Ridge, lay 15 miles away. Lex calculated the risks. A quiet desert settlement, it seemed like a safe haven. But if Obsidian Vale had cast its net, Crescent Ridge could also be a trap. Exhausted and desperate, Lex made his decision. He had no choice. By dawn, he stumbled into Crescent Ridge, his body cloaked in dust and his steps unsteady. The town was as sleepy as he had imagined. A single diner, a gas station, and peeling signs on its storefronts. Lex pulled his hood low over his face and slipped into the diner, choosing a seat in the farthest corner where he could watch the entrance. The waitress didn't spare him a second glance as she poured coffee into a chipped mug and handed him a laminated menu. The food was warm but tasteless, every bite feeling like sand in his mouth. Every sound, a door creaking open, the rumble of a truck outside, set his nerves on edge. Lex's eyes flicked to the television mounted near the counter. The news anchor's polished voice filled the room. Explosions rocked a decommissioned government site in New Mexico last night. Officials have yet to comment on the cause, though sources claim the facility was abandoned decades ago. No injuries have been reported. Lex's grip tightened around the mug, his knuckles white. No injuries meant they hadn't found him. Yet. But it also meant Obsidian Vale was already spinning the narrative, burying the truth before it could surface. Time was slipping through his fingers. He had to act fast. He had to stay ahead. Journalists were out of the question. Obsidian Vale had dossiers on all of them. Governments, complicit, whistleblower organizations, too risky. As his options dwindled, a memory surfaced, faint but persistent. Years ago, Lex had worked alongside Nadia Khalid, a brilliant analyst who had gone underground after exposing corruption in a federal agency. If anyone could help, it was her. She had once mentioned a safe house in Arizona, a remote cabin hidden deep in the woods. If she was still alive, she might Leaving Crescent Ridge as the sun climbed higher, Lex hitched a ride with a rancher heading toward the Arizona border. He kept his answers vague, offering little more than half-truths, the journal and files pressed tightly to his chest beneath his jacket. The rancher didn't pry, and Lex was grateful for the silence. The journey to the safe house took 2 grueling days. Lex slept in abandoned buildings, his body aching and his mind plagued by paranoia. The shadows of passing cars seemed longer and darker, their presence deliberate. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of the wind felt like an omen. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, followed. He was walking into yet another trap. Still, he pressed on. When Lex finally reached the coordinates etched into his memory, he stood before a cabin swallowed by the wilderness. Ivy crept up the weathered wood, and the windows were clouded with dirt. It looked untouched for years, yet it matched Nadia's description perfectly. Lex approached cautiously, his knife ready, each step deliberate. He knocked once, then twice. The sound echoed hollowly through the forest. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the light. Nadia's face appeared, older but unmistakable. Her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned him with a mixture of disbelief and caution. "Lex?" she asked, her voice heavy with years of silence. "You look like hell." "I've been there," he replied, holding up the files, "and I brought it back." Nadia's expression darkened as she stepped aside, motioning him in. She locked the door behind them with a practiced hand. "If they find you here—" "They won't," Lex interrupted, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "But I need your help, Nadia. I can't do this alone." As the door clicked shut, Lex felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. For the first time, he wasn't running alone. Together, he and Nadia would untangle the web of Obsidian Vale's secrets. Together, they might find a way to strike back. For the first time in decades, Lex Hargrove wasn't running. The cabin in the woods, surrounded by wilderness, became a temporary haven. Inside, he sat across from Nadia Khalid at an old wooden table, the journal and files spread between them like puzzle pieces. The tension in the air was palpable as they worked through the evidence, searching for a plan to strike back against Obsidian Vale. Nadia's eyes darted across the pages, her frown deepening with each revelation. "This is worse than I imagined," she muttered, pointing to Project Glassbox on one document. "If even half of this is true, Obsidian Vale's failsafe isn't just about self-preservation. It's a blueprint for global chaos." Lex nodded grimly. Sleeper agents in every major government and corporation, ready to activate at a moment's notice. If we release these files without dismantling their system first, it's over. Governments collapse, economies crash, and the world burns. "Then we dismantle the failsafe," Nadia said firmly. "That's the only way we take them down without sacrificing everything." Lex exhaled. "How? Their network is too vast. They've infiltrated every level of power. Governments, intelligence agencies, media. It's impossible to root them out." "Not alone," Nadia corrected. "And we're not alone, Lex. There are others, people who've been burned by Obsidian Vale, people who've lost everything to them. If we reach them, if we unite, we have a chance." Her words struck something in Lex. He had spent years believing survival meant isolation, that trusting anyone was a death sentence. But Obsidian Vale thrived because it convinced people they were powerless, because it dismantled trust and solidarity. To fight them, Lex understood, meant rebuilding what had been destroyed, belief in others. The cabin became a war room. Nadia contacted allies through encrypted channels, people she hadn't spoken to in years but trusted with her life. Lex, meanwhile, pored over the files, decrypting codes and uncovering a sprawling web of operations. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous their mission became. One evening, as they reviewed their findings, Nadia pointed to a specific set of coordinates buried deep in the files. "This," she said, her voice steady, "this is where we go next." The location was deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a facility hidden beneath layers of security. According to the files, disabling the failsafe required accessing its central system. It was the heart of Obsidian Vale's operation, a place designed to withstand any attack. The journey to the facility was perilous. Lex and Nadia traveled at night, avoiding main roads and staying off the grid. Every mile felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. By the time they reached the Appalachian site, exhaustion weighed heavily on them, but their resolve was unshaken. The facility's entrance was buried beneath rock and overgrowth. They scouted the area for hours, marking patrols, cameras, and hidden entry points. When the moment came, they moved like ghosts through the forest, their breaths shallow as they approached the entrance. Inside, the air was cold and sterile, the halls illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. The facility was a labyrinth of corridors and control rooms, each more foreboding than the last. Lex and Nadia moved quickly but cautiously, guided by the map they had pieced together from the files. At last, they reached the control room. Nadia immediately began hacking into the system, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced precision. Lex stood guard at the door, his pistol drawn. From down the hall, the sound of boots echoed, each step reverberating like a countdown. "Almost there," Nadia whispered, her voice steady despite the tension. Hurry, Lex urged, his grip tightening on the weapon. The guards appeared at the end of the corridor, their weapons drawn. Lex fired a warning shot, the sound ricocheting through the halls. The guards hesitated but didn't retreat. Lex's heart pounded as he fired again, this time aiming to slow them down. "Got it!" Nadia exclaimed. "Failsafe is offline." Lex grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the console as the guards opened fire. Together, they sprinted down the corridor, bullets ricocheting off the walls around them. Adrenaline surged through Lex's veins as he navigated the maze, his instincts driving him forward. Bursting through an emergency exit, they stumbled into the cold night air. They didn't stop running until they were deep in the woods, the facility a distant glow behind them. Only then did they collapse to the ground, their breaths ragged. "It's done," Nadia said between gasps. "The failsafe is gone." Lex looked at her, a rare smile breaking across his face. For the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The battle wasn't over, but they had dealt Obsidian Vale a crippling blow. Together, they had done the impossible. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, Lex and Nadia sat in silence, their thoughts on the war still ahead. The files were safe, the failsafe dismantled, and for the first time, Lex felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. Hope.